Hey guys, what is up? Swim here. These are 5 things that are going to make you into a high-level card game player. This list is directed at people that haven't played card games before, but I promise even if you've played card games at a intermediate level, this will make you a better player. Okay, we're going to start off very basic. Identify at the start of each game who the aggressor is in the matchup. Basically, different decks in different games like to play at different speeds. Aggro is a deck that plays very fast, Control is a deck that plays very slow, and Midrange is somewhere in the middle, but it's a spectrum. So identify who has the slower deck and who has the faster deck between you and your opponent. If you have the faster deck, you need to play very aggressive, very loose. The game is on a clock. If the game goes past a certain turn, your odds of winning go really down, right? So you effectively need to understand that you're on a clock, win the game, be very, very aggressive and force their Nexus health down low at all costs. Don't play for super long term unless you feel like you have to in a situation. If you are the slower deck in the matchup, then just slow the game down at all costs. You can take value trades that aren't going to be as valuable. For example, blocking with a valuable unit just to protect your life total near the end when your life total is getting under around 10 or so, and that is going to help you outlast your opponent. So if you're the slower deck, play to that advantage and just make sure you're slowing the game down and not committing resources into dealing Nexus damage to them, because if you're the slower deck, that's not your win condition. If you're the faster deck, you often don't want to play overprotective of your own Nexus health. Your win condition is trying to close out the game fairly early, and there's a lot of situations where your opponent might attack and you shouldn't be taking a block just to make sure you're keeping your units alive so that you can force out the game nice and early and have more attackers on your next turn. Okay, rule number 2, understand that the board is an engine representing per turn value, even with just a vanilla unit stat line. Think about it like you would any other engine in any other game. For example, like farming in a game like a MOBA. So what that means is that ownership of the board will represent control over the outcome of the game in a lot of situations. So treat your units very, very importantly, and make sure you're not deleting them just to protect your Nexus health in situations where you don't need to protect your Nexus health. Again, going back to the matchups we were talking about before. So whenever possible, try to keep proactive ownership of the board. All right, these are the 2 early game tips. Now let's get into some late game tips. So a really, really big one, the number 1 late game tip is know your lose condition, your win condition, and your plan for timing. Starting with timing, think about in late game situations what turn you plan to kill your opponent by, depending on whether you're attacking, evens or odds. Have a plan, okay, they're at 7 health, I can kill them 2 turns from now, but only if I play a certain way. With this plan in mind, make sure to develop your board and choose blockers in a way that enables that plan, right? You can let your opponent get you down to low health if you think they can't finish you off, just so that you can save a blocker to then use on offense to kill them 1 turn earlier. The game is effectively a race to get the opponent's Nexus health down earlier, and there's often very common situations where by holding back 1 extra blocker, you might be able to, push lethal 1 turn earlier, and the difference between you having 3 Nexus health and the difference between you having 7 might make 0 difference. Alright, now we get to win conditions and lose conditions, and this is where high-level card game players really get to prove themselves. So, when you're winning, when you feel in a very dominant position, 80% chance to win or something like that, then ask yourself one simple question. What would have to be the state of situations such that I might not win this game, right? What is going to go wrong? Like, for example, if your opponent's deck might have a card that counters whatever you have on board or in hand, then pretend and effectively assume that they will have that card, right? Play around that lose condition and make your plays based on that assumption, even if they are weaker plays, right? Because you can afford to lower your win rate when they don't have that card so that you can increase your win rate when they do, because your win rate is high enough already. Likewise, when you feel in a really powerless situation, when you feel really, really behind, you do the opposite. You assume that things are going to go very well for you. You take risks. to put things in another way, because risks will fundamentally gravitate your win rate towards 50% from either direction, right? So by taking risks, you can have a bit of a higher win rate. Think to yourself, okay, the only way I can really win here is if the opponent has a pretty bad hand, if they don't have this card. So because playing around with this card wouldn't give me a win, we can make our plays 100% assuming that they don't have the card, right? And likewise, maybe I need to draw a certain card next turn to even be able to win. Well, I should make my plays assuming I will draw that card. I should note that these are for more extreme situations. In most games, you're going to be pretty neck and neck and you won't have to think about this, but when you do, you're going to feel like a pro. Rule number 4, make your deck balanced. Now, you guys can just, copy decks. You don't have to build your own decks, but if you want to, balance is the #1 fundamental in deck building. You need to have options for early game and you need to have options for late game. I see a lot of new players' decks that are trying to skew too far in one direction. You need to be stable yet situational. I think that a good deck is kind of like a tree with branches. You need a solid foundation for a strategy. That's like your trunk. That's the thing tying the tree together. And then you need some peripheries that are going to help, beat certain situations. And I think a really, really important thing about this is you don't want to have too many like 1-ofs and 2-ofs in your deck build. A very, very common new player mistake is to try to build with just too many different cards, and that would end up kind of being a tree with too big branches, not enough trunk, crumbling under its own weight, right? The #1 most important thing is you need that stable foundation first, and then just have some situational branch options, depending on what happens to come up, on top of that. A good deck will typically have 10 or 11 3-of cards in terms of, 30 or 33 different slots, and then the last 7 to 10 slots, being filled by 1-ofs and 2-ofs. Now, this is a rule of thumb. There's going to be some exceptions, but it's a great place to start. You'll also need a, balanced mana curve. That's going to be important in any deck build. But I would say the #1 thing that will really, really help you take your game to the next level as a deck builder is figuring out where you're weak and where you're strong in the deck build. So ask yourself, what situations am I weak in and what situations am I strong in? These can be matchups or hand states. So those are going to be the two biggest ones. So if your deck is really strong against matchup A and your deck is really weak against matchup B, well, then think about maybe making your matchup A bit weaker, taking out 1 or 2 cards that are really mostly good in matchup A, and then making them have cards instead that are good against matchup B. Basically, taking from situations where you are already strong and giving to situations where you are weak. It's the same exact thing with hand states. There's a lot of decks, especially more combo-y style decks reliant around a specific card where, if you build a deck in a certain way, if you draw 1 of this card, then you have a really, really good win rate. And I see a lot of people kind of concede the percent of games where they don't draw this card. Whereas it's a really, really good idea to look at this deck build and think to yourself, okay, I am in losing situations when I don't draw this card. How can I make my deck a bit weaker when I do draw my card, and of course, a bit stronger when I don't? Maybe make it a little bit less committed to drawing that card. Again, there's some exceptions when you can force immense reliability over a certain card or when you don't otherwise have a choice, but as a rule of thumb, you don't want to be conceding spots. You want to be basically taking, again, from situations where you are strong and giving to situations where you are weak. I want to drive this home because it's really important to understand this is the same exact thing that happens when you're playing the game too. When you're playing the game, in the last rule I mentioned, where you are really ahead, you want to kind of assume that they have an answer, and basically, you don't know whether you're strong or weak, so you want to steal win rate percentage from the situation where you're strong. In your head, you're like, okay, I'm really going to win unless he has this card, right? And then give that win rate percentage to the situation where you are weak, which is to say, assume that you're a bit weaker than you actually are, right? Because you will have a higher win rate overall if you try to balance situations like that. I think a great way of thinking about this is have a mindset of problem solving. When you are in the deck is the best example of this, but again, it applies to both. Think to yourself not, ooh, what makes me powerful, but think, okay, what are my problems? What does this deck struggle with? Think about that for a while and then solve those problems. It's a really, really imperative step, and I see a lot of deck builders skip it. Okay, and rule number 5, know what you can play around and what you can't. And this is going to depend a lot on the situation, but I see a lot of players, especially new players, making the mistake of playing around things that, at the end of the day, the reason they're strong is because you can't really play around them, and by trying to, you're even just giving them more value. A great example is combat tricks, and you'll see this in Magic as well. So these are burst speed spells that modify the outcome of combat, like Radiant Strike and Back-to-Back. So I see a lot of players basically too timid to attack because, you know, what if the opponent has a combat trick in hand? In reality, the reason why these cards are strong is kind of because you can pretty much not play around them. Sometimes for a powerful card like Back-to-Back, you can maybe, you know, try to keep a certain tool in hand at an early turn so you'll have an answer when that happens. But for the most part, at burst speed, there's no like reactability. There's not a crazy amount you can do. So it's best to not give them even more value by being too afraid. If it happens, it happens. Whereas on the contrary, there are some fairly powerful cards like Detain, for example, not a super powerful card, but it's fairly powerful card. It's very counterable, right? This is something that you can definitely change the way you play even before it drops or in response to it dropping, and you will be able to gain a lot of value out of that. Think about the game from the perspective of the opponent's hand. This is super imperative, and make sure you are trying to build or play in a way that will potentially break their value. Again, fundamentally, building and playing have the same fundamentals. Super important to get this down. So, for example, if the opponent is Detain, if that's a threat in the meta or in the match, whatever, you can build a deck that doesn't run too many tall units, or whenever you're against Demacia, maybe you can make sure not to use buffs on units that are already big, right? You are limiting the maximum value of the card in their hand, which is pretty powerful because it makes it a bit weaker of an option to choose, right? Whereas by not attacking with something like a combat trick, you're not really changing the value of the card in their hand. You're just saying, okay, you'll probably have to use this later. They're always going to get value out of cards like these. You can't stop it. That's why they're good. So don't just waste your own value, basically, you know, relegating that action to a later turn, because you're not bricking the card in their hand. You're just making it so they can't use it that turn. As another powerful example, Deny is a card that you can play around. Absolutely. There's a lot of situations where you will be playing around this card, and it's much more counterable than a lot of the most powerful spells in the game, despite Deny being fairly powerful. Now, a big way to play around it is obviously, you know, if your opponent has some mana left up, maybe you can not play something super big, play your medium-sized spells or medium impact spells before you play your super high ones. But another way to play around Deny is if you are running a deck that has almost no slow or fast speed spells, what you can do is you can just cut them entirely, right? If you're running a deck that has maybe 2 or 3 slow speed spells, it might not be a bad idea to eject them out of your deck. By doing this, you have a deck with 0 deniable cards, and effectively, when you hit a matchup with Ionia, which will be fairly common, you will have a situation where your opponent has Deny in their hand some percentage of the time, and they can never play it, right? That's a great way to counter a card that you can do sometimes in your deck build. All right, and once you have that final mentality of making sure you're thinking about the game from the perspective of the opponent's hand and about, you know, their maintained value, whether you're bricking the card or whether you're just delaying the inevitable, now you have the tools that are going to set you out on a good start and become a much better player. I didn't want to do a super like quick tips video. I wanted to really ingrain upon you guys fundamentals. This is something that honestly, for brand new players, if you want quick tips, like very just fast, like, you know, do this, net deck this, I can give you that, and I will do other videos like that will give you the quickest boost right away. But this video I designed to basically give you the fundamentals that you need to start thinking about the game in the right way that will make you not just, you know, not a new player anymore, but eventually a high level player.